In the limestone dark of a Cretan cave, the air is cold. Not the cold of a winter night that passes when the sun returns, but the cold that is gathered inside rock over a very long time, held in the stone itself, settled into a kind of permanent stillness. The cave sits somewhere on the slopes of the mountain, the Greeks called Ida, or in some accounts on Mount Dicte, not far distant, and it is deeply quiet inside, except that just beyond the mouth of the cave, it is not quiet at all. Outside, in the dark, warrior priests are moving. The curettes, that is what the tradition calls them, armored men, young and deliberate, raising bronze-edged shields and swords in the mountain night, and bringing them together with a sound that rolls outward and down the slope and loses itself eventually in ordinary wind. They are doing this because inside the cave, on the cold ground, a child is sleeping, and the child must not be heard. The child is Zeus. He lies there on the Cretan hillside in the deepest dark, in the deepest interior cold of the mountain, kept warm by an animal pressing close. That animal is Amalthea, a divine goat, white or golden, depending on the version, her breath steady and warm, fogging the air of the limestone chamber in small clouds that dissipate before they reach the ceiling. Her flank is pressed against the child's body. He sleeps against the warmth of her, and she stands over him. And outside the curates go on making their noise, because the sound of those weapons and shields clashing and ringing in the Cretan dark is what will prevent a father from hearing his own son cry. The clash carries, the cry does not. That is the purpose of all that bronze on the mountain. The reason a child needed to be hidden on a mountainside in Crete, kept alive by a divine goat, protected by armed men, making ritual noise in the dark, is a reason that goes back one generation further, back to the Titans, and to the particular nature of the figure who was then king of them. Cronus was the youngest of the Titans, born to the earth herself, Gaia, and to the sky above her, Uranus, the starry heaven, the first sky. He was the one who had overthrown his own father, armed with a flint sickle that Gaia had made for him, and after his victory he had taken his sister Rhea as his consort and ruled over the age that followed, which the poets would later remember as a golden time, a time of easy abundance and long life. Hesiod holds that account in the Theogony and in the Works and Days both, and there is something in it worth sitting with for a moment. The idea that the god most responsible for the orderly cruelty at the center of this story was also the god under whose reign the earth produced her wealth most freely, the god whose age the later Greeks looked back on with something like nostalgia. Time contains many things at once, so do gods. What Cronus did according to the account Hesiod preserves was this. He had been warned by Gaia, or by Aranos, or by the voice of prophecy that moved through the oldest divine figures that one of his own children would do to him what he had done to his father. A child of his own blood would one day overthrow him. This is the kind of knowledge that changes how a figure moves through time. Cronus knew, and so he waited, and when Rhea gave birth to their first child, he swallowed the infant whole. The first was Hestia, then Hera, then Demeter, then Poseidon, then Hades. One after another, as Rhea gave birth to them, Cronus received each child and swallowed it, and in this way he held all of them inside himself in the dark, not dead. The tradition is clear about that. Not dead and not sleeping, but waiting inside the body of their father in a stillness that lasted not days, but years. The quiet they kept inside Cronus had no length that could be measured against the ordinary movement of time. The siblings were together in an absolute stillness, and the world above them went on turning in the golden age and Rhea alone knew that her children were there. The swallowed siblings are one of those mythological images that resists being looked at directly and becomes more legible when it is held at a slight angle. This is not the same as cruelty in any straightforward human sense. It is a structural act, a cosmological act, the ruler of the present moment incorporating within himself all of the future that he cannot afford to allow. The children inside Cronus were the future, gathered up and swallowed. What the tradition describes is time trying to hold time still. Rhea did not accept it. When Zeus was born, the sixth child, the youngest, the one Cronus had not yet swallowed, Rhea moved. The tradition says she went to Gaia for counsel, and what Gaia and Aranos advised her together was to travel to Crete and to give birth there in secret, in the dark. So Rhea wrapped a stone in swaddling cloths. In the night, her hands moving carefully in the dark, the way hands do when they are doing something important under a time constraint and the light is insufficient for the task. The stone was of a reasonable size and weight. She presented it to Cronus. He swallowed it whole and did not pause. He was not deceived by the softness of the cloth or by any of Rhea's manner, because the deception required so little. Cronus was not skeptical in that moment. He was simply continuing. A stone wrapped in cloth is as convincing as a child wrapped in cloth. If what you expect to find in your consort's arms is something small and swaddled, and if certainty has made you careless, Rhea's hands moving in the dark over the shape of that stone, arranging the folds of cloth to approximate the right weight and the right mass, is one of those quiet images that the tradition places at the origin of everything that follows. All of it begins there. The stone goes down in place of the child. The child goes to Crete. The mountain receives him. Amalthea stands watch over him in the cold interior of the cave. And outside, the Curites clash their weapons in the dark, and the sound of all that bronze lifts and rolls away and dissolves into the ordinary noises of the mountainside, and the child goes on sleeping. It was on that same island, on Crete, that the divine goat Amalthea gave the child Zeus something beyond warmth and proximity. She gave him her milk, and in some versions of the tradition, she is said to have been more than simply a divine animal, a divine being who had taken the form of a goat, or a goat raised by nymphs charged with the child's care, or the supernatural mother of a horn filled with unceasing plenty, the cornucopia, the horn of abundance, which the tradition traces back to Amalthea's horn, broken off accidentally by the young Zeus and given the power to fill itself with whatever its holder needed. These variations in the account are not contradictions, so much as evidence of how many separate places and communities held some version of this same story, each adding what they understood, each preserving a different facet of what they believed the cave on Ida had contained. The cave itself is worth dwelling inside for a moment longer, because it concentrates so much of what the tradition is trying to establish. A cave is concealment. A cave is interiority. It is the earth holding something inside itself, the way Cronus held his children inside himself, with the crucial difference that the cave will open and release what it contains. The child in the cave will not stay there. The future Cronus tried to swallow is sleeping in the earth's own interior, being fed by a divine animal, protected by warriors whose purpose is to make noise and nothing else. And the cold of the limestone is specific. It is not the soft dark of sleep, but the cold dark of waiting, the cold of something that has not yet happened, that is being held in the stone until the time arrives and the stone releases it. Outside the cave, the Cretan night goes on. The Curites raise their weapons and bring them down. The sound spreads across the slope and empties itself into wind. Somewhere below the mountain, in the valleys and along the coasts, the Golden Age continues, Cronus ruling, the earth providing, time appearing to hold still. But inside the cave, in the cold, a child is growing. It is necessary to turn from Crete and from Zeus for a moment, to look at Hera separately. Because among the things that are easily collapsed when the two are brought together too quickly is the independent fact of what Hera was before their union, what she was in her own right, where she had come from and what she governed, and why the ancient sites dedicated to her were distributed across the Greek world in a pattern that suggests something older and deeper than any single story can accommodate. Hera was in the genealogy the tradition preserves, born to Cronus and Rhea on the same terms as her siblings, the second child, the first daughter, swallowed after Hestia and before Demeter. She spent the years of Zeus's Cretan childhood inside her father, in the dark that was not sleep and not death, held there with Hestia beside her, and Demeter and Poseidon and Hades, the five of them waiting in that absolute stillness, while their youngest sibling grew on a mountain far away. This is one of the things that makes the tradition's portrait of Hera so much more layered than the surface of the Homeric text suggests. She was, before anything, a divine being who had endured a particular kind of captivity, who had been held inside her father while her youngest brother grew in secret outside, and who came into the full exercise of her power only after a liberation she had not been able to bring about through her own effort. The release came through a device provided in many accounts by the goddess Metis, whose name carries the weight of counsel and practical intelligence, the strategic mind that can find the specific tool for the specific problem. What Metis provided was an emetic, a herb or a preparation of some kind that, when administered, caused Cronus to disgorge what he had swallowed. Zeus obtained this and gave it to his father, and one by one, in reverse order of swallowing, the siblings emerged. Hades and Poseidon and Demeter and Hera and Hestia, returning to the world that had gone on without them. The Titanomachy followed. Hesiod describes it at length in the Theogony, a war between the Olympians and the Titans, the generation that had ruled against the generation that would replace it, the conflict that lasted 10 full years. 10 years of war between divine forces, fought at a scale that Hesiod describes in images of massive physical upheaval, the earth shaking, the sea boiling, the sky groaning with the weight of what was being contested. At the end of it, the Titans were defeated. Cronus was bound. The three sons of Cronus divided the world between them, Zeus taking the sky, Poseidon taking the sea, Hades taking what lay beneath the earth, and the age that followed was the age of the Olympians. All of this, Hera survived. She had been swallowed and held and disgorged and had fought in a 10-year war and had come through it into a world that was now being organized around the three brothers and their new authority. It is worth pausing over the sheer duration and weight of what the tradition places in Hera's past before she appears in any story about her own marriages, or her own temples, or her own domains. She is not a figure who arrives already settled. She is a figure who arrives having come through an enormous amount and carrying in her divine nature an authority that is not borrowed and not delegated and did not originate in any male figure's decision to grant it. The name itself carries something of this. Hera is one of those divine names whose etymology the scholars have argued over without arriving at consensus. Some have suggested a connection to a root meaning lady or mistress, a title as much as a name. Others have noted that the name may derive from a pre-Greek substrate, a linguistic layer that predates the Hellenic languages and the mythology built in them, which would make Hera not simply an Olympian, but a figure whose identity was already present in some form before the Olympian framework assembled itself around her. This is not a certainty. It is, however, consistent with what the distribution of her ancient sanctuaries suggests. At Argos, Hera had a sanctuary of very great antiquity, the Heraion of Argos, set on a terraced hillside between what were eventually the cities of Argos and Mycenae, its columns visible from the plain below at any hour of the day when the light was good. The Arg of Heraion was not a place that felt like a recent construction when the poets were writing. It was already old when the stories were being told. Its setting on the hillside terrace, commanding a view of the plain that stretches toward the sea, suggests a deliberate placement, the kind of placement that comes from a long local tradition of holding a particular site as the location where a particular power is concentrated. Hera at Argos was not the consort of Zeus brought to a new temple by a population that had recently adopted her worship. She was the central divine figure of that region, with a sanctuary that suggested roots running back before any of the assembled stories about her marriage, or her jealousy, or her conflicts with the king of the gods. On the island of Samos, the same deep antiquity holds the Heraion at Samos, which will emerge again in later parts of this account, was one of the largest and most continuously maintained sanctuaries in the ancient Greek world, a temple complex at the mouth of the Imbrasos River that was being built and rebuilt and expanded across many generations, a project of such sustained dedication that its columns were still being added when the classical period was already well advanced. The Samians held that something essential about Hera was connected to their island in a way that predated the Olympian arrangement. Their traditions made claims about her that did not depend on Zeus for their authority. What Hera governed across all these ancient sites and across the full range of the mythological tradition was the lives of women, not simply in the domestic sense, though that is present, but in the most structural sense, the sense of the major transitions that define a female life as the ancient Greek world understood it. The tradition encoded this in 3 cult epithets that were in use at her temple at Stymphalus in the northeastern Peloponnese. The first was Pays, girl, the young and unmarried female still in her father's keeping. The second was Talia, the completed or fulfilled one, which in the specific context of Hera's worship meant the married woman, the woman who had undergone the great transition of the wedding rite and moved from one household to another, from one set of protections to another, from one status to another. And the third was Chera, the widow, the woman who had passed through the marriage state and come out the other side of it alone, the woman whose husband was dead and whose status had changed again. 3 words carved into the ancient stone of Stymphalus, 3 stages in the life of a woman held in the name of a single goddess. This is a remarkable range for any single divine figure to hold in their domain: the girl, the bride, the widow. These are not simply 3 points on a timeline, but 3 entirely different modes of existing in the world, each carrying its own set of legal and social and spiritual conditions, each requiring a different kind of divine attentiveness. Hera at Stymphalus is the goddess who accompanies the transitions themselves, who stands at the threshold between each state and the next, who is present at the moment when a female life changes its fundamental form. This is not a deity of domestic comfort or marital oversight in any narrow sense. This is a deity of transformation, of the irreversible passages that mark a life. When the tradition built the marriage of Hera and Zeus at the center of its account of the divine order, it was not placing a domestic arrangement at the center of the cosmos. It was placing the domain of womanhood in its full depth, girlhood, marriage, widowhood, every major transformation the female life contained in relation to the domain of divine authority over the sky and the natural order. The union of Hera and Zeus, whatever else it was, and however the later poets complicated it and deepened its conflicts, was a union between two enormous and separately rooted powers. That is the most important thing to hold clearly. The Cretan cave, cold in the limestone dark, with the warm flank of Amalthea pressed against the sleeping child, that is where Zeus's story begins. And somewhere else, inside the body of Cronus, in a stillness that lasted years, in the dark that was not sleep and not death, Hera waited. Both of them came to Olympus through an enormous amount of prior existence. Both of them arrived carrying the full weight of divine identities that had been formed long before they were ever placed in relation to each other. The goat's breath in the cold air, the weapons ringing on the mountain slope, the stone wrapped in cloth descending into Cronus, the siblings held inside him in the dark, the war that lasted 10 years, and then on a terraced hillside above the plain of Argos, the columns of a very old temple catching the morning light, the sanctuary of a goddess whose name predates the system of stories that was built around her, whose domain enclosed the full arc of a woman's life, whose 3 ancient epithets were cut into the stone of Stymphalus and left there: Pais, Teleia, Chera, girl, bride, widow. 3 words in ancient stone, 3 stages a goddess old enough to contain all 3 at once, standing at each threshold, present at each transformation, her authority, not derived from any marriage or any decision made on Olympus, but older than that, rooted in a pre-Greek past that the later poets inherited without entirely understanding. Hera at Stymphalus is not simply the wife of the king of the gods. She is the goddess who held within her domain the passage from girlhood to marriage, and from marriage into the long life after it ends. She is a figure who knows what it is to wait in the dark inside something you did not choose, and to come out of it carrying everything you had before. The cold of the Cretan cave is a particular cold. The stillness inside Cronus is a particular stillness. Between those 2 kinds of darkness, one a cave in which a child grows toward the future, one a captivity in which a divine being waits without moving through time, the full story begins, and it has been beginning in that same way for as long as anyone has been telling it. The stone columns at Argos catch the light of the plain below and hold it. The limestone of the Cretan cave holds its cold, and somewhere in the ancient stone of Stymphalus, the 3 words remain, cut into the rock in the order the goddess's domain required them to appear: the girl, and then the bride, and then the one who remains when the marriage is done. Pais Teclia, Chera, a goddess old enough to contain all 3 at once, quietly present at every threshold, the temple standing on its hillside in the morning light, as it has stood for longer than the stories can account for, and the stone resting, as stone does, in a patience that requires no effort and admits no end. On the slopes of Mount Catharon, a small bird sat hunched in the rain. Its feathers were flattened against its body, the barred gray and white of them darkened with water and pressed close so that the creature looked half its ordinary size. Its eyes were mostly closed. It held itself in the particular posture of something very cold, trying to become very still, as though stillness might be a kind of warmth, as though the right kind of quietness might hold the weather back. The rain moved across the mountainside in soft, shifting curtains, and the bird sat in the middle of it, entirely alone, and did not move. Hera found it there, or came upon it, or perhaps noticed it the way that a goddess notices something small and suffering with a quality of attention that moves more slowly than ordinary sight and lands more completely. The bird was a cuckoo, the small, disheveled, shivering at some register below what the eye could see, its narrow head lowered and its feet gripping whatever surface it had found. In the oldest version of this story, the one that seems to sit closest to wherever the myth began, it was the sight of the creature's distress that moved her. She was not deceived by anything. She was moved. There is a difference, and the story depends on it. She cupped her hands around the bird and brought it close to her body to warm it. Her palms closed over its wet feathers, and she held it against the warmth of her chest. And the rain continued across the mountain, and the cuckoo sat in the cup of the goddess's hands, with its eyes still mostly shut. And then Zeus resumed his divine form. The myth does not pause here for long. What happened next, the declaration, the moment of recognition, the shift from a goddess holding a small shivering bird to something entirely different, is handled by the tradition with a kind of swift certainty, as though the story knows that the details of the transformation matter less than what followed from it. What followed from it was a marriage. What followed from it was an ordering of the world. What followed from it was everything that came after, laid out in consequence after consequence, like stones crossing a river, each one placed by what came before. The mountain where this happened, Cithaeron, in Boeotia, in the northeast of the Peloponnese, was a place the Greeks associated with a number of stories that carried weight. It was already a mountain that appeared in myth as a place where things changed, where transformations occurred and identities slipped or were revealed, that a courtship should begin there, in rain, with a small bird and a moment of ordinary compassion, sits in some ways very naturally against that landscape. The place was already ready for the kind of story that shifts something at its center and then moves outward from there. The Greek tradition did not settle on a single place for the courtship or a single island for the marriage. More than one location held a claim to the wedding of Hera and Zeus, and the claims were not considered contradictions so much as evidence of the event's importance, the kind of sacred moment that leaves its mark on more than one piece of ground. Mount Cithaeron held the story of the meeting. Samos held the story of the marriage itself, or at least a version of the marriage, a version told with such authority and such ritual persistence that it eventually became the central one for the purposes of the Samians, who were not a people inclined to let their claim sit quietly. On Samos, the tradition held that Hera and Zeus were married in secret, on the island itself, near the mouth of the Imbrasos River, where the reeds grew thick along the bank, and the light on the water moved in the particular way that coastal light moves when there is nothing to interrupt it. The details of the marriage, who was present, what rites were observed, were held closely by the island's religious community, because what the Samians celebrated was not merely an ancient story, but a living ritual that renewed itself year after year, and the knowledge embedded in the ritual was not simply information to be distributed, but something that had to be enacted to be real. The ritual the Samians performed was among the more unusual in the Greek religious calendar, and it deserves to be held for a moment before moving past it. Each year, the cult statue of Hera, the ancient image that stood within her great temple, the Hera Nior, near the Imbrasos, was taken from her temple and carried to the shore. The statue was set down among the reeds at the edge of the water, as though Hera had departed, as though the goddess had fled her own sanctuary and was waiting, unhoused, among the marsh plants at the edge of the Aegean, her divinity temporarily at the boundary between the settled world of the temple and the open water beyond. The statue was then washed with river water, fresh water, running water, brought from the Imbrasos itself, poured over the ancient image there at the edge of the sea, and then it was wrapped in fresh linen, dressed again, and carried slowly back to the temple. The procession returned. The statue was replaced within the sanctuary. Hera was home again, reinstated, the sacred marriage renewed by the act of its reenactment. Each year, the goddess left, and each year she was brought back, and the island understood this repetition as something necessary, not nostalgia for an ancient event, but the active maintenance of an ongoing reality. The Samians called this festival the Tonia, a name derived from the Greek for rope or cord, referring to a related tradition in which the cult statue was at some point tied with willow branches to prevent it from wandering further, a detail that hovers between the practical and the mythological, with the comfortable ambiguity that characterizes much of what the Greeks did when ritual and story touched each other. Whether the branches meant anything beyond what they literally did is a question the Samians themselves may not have thought worth answering, because the doing of it was the answer, and the answer was renewed each time it was done. The Herion of Samos was one of the great sanctuaries of the ancient world. Generations of construction had been poured into it, stone replacing earlier wood, columns multiplying, the temple precinct expanding outward toward the river and the shore in a long accumulation of dedicated effort that left the building, even after centuries, still in some sense incomplete. The colonnade that surrounded the temple was among the most ambitious in the Greek world, a double row of massive columns arranged around a central sanctuary that held the most ancient version of Hera's image, an archaic plank-like figure that predated the more fully articulated cult statues of the classical period by a very long time. The very antiquity of that image was part of the point. The oldest representation of Hera was not the fully robed and enthroned queen that later iconography settled on. It was something much simpler, something that had been in that place before anyone had thought to explain it, in the terms that later became standard. There was another thing about the Herion that the tradition held, the willow tree. The oldest accounts maintained that the ancient cult image had been found or originally placed at the root of a willow tree near the Imbrazos River, and that the willow remained part of the sanctuary's sacred landscape throughout its long history. The willow, like the river, like the reeds, like the shore itself, was a feature of the place that predated any myth attached to it. The goddess was already there. The story came later, as stories do, and it arranged itself around the features that were already present. The Argives, for their part, would not cede the wedding to Samos. Argos had its own claim on Hera, one rooted as deep as any in the Greek world, and the sanctuary at the Hera-Theon of Argos, set on a terraced hillside between the cities of Argos and Mycenae, its columns visible from the plain below at many hours of the day, was among the oldest and most important in Greece. The Argive tradition was not always consistent with the Samian tradition about where the marriage took place, and neither tradition was troubled by the inconsistency, because the point was not the location, but the fact, and the fact was not in dispute. Both traditions agreed that Hera and Zeus were married. Both traditions agreed that the marriage was not a small or private event, but a moment of cosmic significance, the ordering of divine power into a structure that the world could be understood through. In the Argive tradition, the marriage was associated with the sacred landscape of the Argolid, with the particular quality of the light in that part of the Peloponnese, with the long sightlines across a plain that was already ancient when the myths that explain it were being assembled. The Herion of Argos may have been there before any fully articulated story attached to Hera had been worked out. The sanctuary was that old, and what it held in its oldest layers belonged to a religious landscape the later mythology arrived to find already in place. The Horae were present at the wedding of Hera and Zeus. This is the kind of detail that the tradition states without extensive elaboration, because within the Greek understanding of the world, the presence of certain figures at certain events was not incidental, but structural. The Horae, named by Hesiod in the Theogony as Eunomia, Dike, and Irene, were goddesses of lawfulness, of justice, and of peace. They were associated with the gates of Olympus, with the proper ordering of things at the boundary between what was divine and what was not, with the maintenance of the conditions under which divine ritual could occur correctly. To have them at the wedding was to have the conditions of right order themselves present at the moment the central divine marriage was founded. Eunomia, whose name means lawfulness or good order. Dike, whose name means justice, the rightness of things in their proper arrangement. Irene, peace, not the absence of conflict so much as the active presence of the conditions in which things can be at rest. Their mother, in Hesiod's account, was Themis herself, the tightness of divine law and the right order of things, which made their presence at the marriage not just appropriate, but something close to inevitable. The daughters of law stood at the gates while the marriage that ordered the divine world was concluded. The gates opened, the gods came with their gifts. Among those gifts, and this is the one the tradition lingers on, the one that carried the furthest into subsequent myth, was a tree, not an ordinary tree. Gaia herself, the earth, gave Hera a tree as a wedding gift, and the tree bore golden apples, actual gold, or something described as gold, the warm, permanent gleam of it in fruit hanging from branches in a garden at the western edge of the world, where the light was always late afternoon and the sky had the particular quality of a sky that has been that color for a very long time. The garden was placed beyond the reach of ordinary geography, at the western edge of the world, where the world ended and whatever lay beyond it began. The tradition was not always precise about what lay past the edge, but it was precise about the garden's location, which was somewhere that ordinary travel could not reach without divine assistance or an extraordinary series of events. The tree stood in its garden. The apples hung from its branches in permanent ripeness, gold or golden, the word itself hovering between the literal and the qualitative. To tend the garden, the Hesperides were set, the daughters of evening. Their name means western ones, or daughters of the dusk, the evening land, 3 or 4 or 7 of them, depending on the source, their names varying across the tradition without any version seeming authoritative enough to settle the question permanently. They were sometimes daughters of Atlas, who held the sky at the western edge of the world near their garden. They were sometimes daughters of Night, which gave them a different kind of antiquity, a connection to the oldest layers of the divine genealogy. What they did was consistent. They tended the garden. They were associated with the golden apples, and their presence marked the place as belonging to a different order than the ordinary world. The serpent Ladon was also there, coiled at the roots of the apple tree, or coiled around its trunk, or simply present within the garden in the capacity of guardian. The details vary, but the serpent is consistent. Ladon was not a minor creature, but a very old one, a child of the sea god Phorcys and the ancient figure Sato. In some accounts, a child of the earth itself, in others, large and coiled and luminous in the particular way that great serpents in Greek myth often are, creatures of the boundary between the protected thing and whatever might approach it, their permanent watchfulness, the condition under which the guarded thing could remain safe. What the apples were for, what they meant, what happened to them, was something the tradition worked out across many episodes and many stories, of which the most famous involved the hero Heracles and his 11th labor, in which he was required to fetch some of the golden fruit, and discovered in the process the various arrangements of serpent and daughters of evening that kept it from casual access. But the garden itself and the tree existed before any of those stories, established at the wedding as a gift and persisting afterward as a feature of the world's far western edge long after the occasion that created them had passed. A gift given at a wedding is, in some sense, an expression of what the giver believes the marriage to be, what kind of thing they are celebrating, and what they wish for it. Gaia's gift of the golden tree was a particular kind of statement. The earth giving to the Queen of Heaven on the occasion of her marriage to the King of Heaven chose to give something permanent, something placed at the edge of the known world, something beautiful and guarded, and unreachable by ordinary means. Whether the tradition intended this reading is not entirely clear, but it sits there in the story without being inconsistent with it. There was already something remarkable about the fact of the marriage itself, considered at the scale the Greeks considered it. Zeus was not a figure contained by domestic life. His nature, the tradition held, was too large and too various for containment of any kind. Hera was not a figure who diminished within a marriage. Her domains, her power, her reach across the lives of mortals were not secondary to the marriage, but predated it and continued through it. What the sacred marriage created was a structure, a way of organizing the relationship between divine authority and divine order, between the principle that generates and the principle that sustains, between the force that moves and the form that holds. The scholars who have examined Hieros-Gamos rituals, the sacred marriage ceremonies of the ancient Greek world, of which the Samian ritual is one example, have generally argued that such ceremonies served purposes that extended well beyond simple commemoration. Walter Burkert, in his careful work on Greek religion, and Martin Nilsson, in his studies of Greek festivals, both pointed toward the civic and agricultural dimensions of these rituals. To reenact the sacred marriage of Hera and Zeus was to ensure something, not merely to remember something. What it ensured was various: the fertility of the land in the season to come, the legitimacy of the institutions through which the community ordered itself, the renewal of the cosmic arrangement that made the human world possible in the first place. The fertility aspect is not hard to understand within the logic of the world the Greeks inhabited. The marriage of heaven and earth, and in this case, the marriage of the king of the sky with the queen who presided over the great transitions of life, was a generative act at a cosmic level, and its reenactment on the ground was a way of calling that generative force back into the agricultural and social cycle. The land needed rain. The land needed the right ordering of seasons. The communities built on the land needed the divine authority that legitimized their own arrangements. All of these were renewed when the marriage was renewed, when the statue was carried to the shore and brought back dressed in fresh linen, when the gates of Olympus opened, and the Horae stood at their post, and the gods came forward with their gifts. This is the Greek understanding of ritual, broadly stated, that the right performance of the act made the act real again. Not a performance in the sense of representation, but a performance in the sense that the word originally carried, a carrying out, a completion, a bringing to full occurrence. The Samians carrying Hera's statue to the water and back were not staging a memory. They were completing a sacred event in the present tense, folding it back into the ongoing life of the world. The cuckoo, which had started all of this on the slopes of Mount Kithaeron, found its way into the iconographic tradition of Hera's sanctuaries in a form more permanent than feathers and rain. At the ancient Heron of Argos, the great cult statue of Hera described by the ancient traveler and geographer Pausanias when he visited the sanctuary in the 2nd century of the Common Era, was an ivory and gold creation by the sculptor Polykleitos, a vast enthroned figure of the goddess in her queenly aspect, crowned, attended, fully composed. On the top of her scepter, which she held in one hand, was a cuckoo carved in relief. Small, easy to miss, permanent. Pausanias noted the bird, and noted also the tradition attached to it, that Zeus had disguised himself as this bird before the marriage. He found the story interesting enough to record, but did not elaborate at length, because within the religious and mythological landscape that Pausanias was documenting, the cuckoo on the scepter was not an oddity that required extensive explanation, but a reference that anyone who knew the tradition would understand immediately. The bird was there because the bird was part of the story. The story was part of Hera. Hera was part of the place and had been for long enough that the temple built to her had passed through several iterations before Polykleitos was asked to make the gold and ivory image that Pausanias eventually came to describe. The cuckoo is an interesting bird to have chosen, which the tradition does not explain, and perhaps was not required to. The cuckoo is associated with the coming of spring in Greek tradition, with the first warmth returning to the world after winter. It is a bird that announces a season rather than inhabiting it. It arrives, it calls, and it is associated with the change from cold to warm, with the moment when the year turns and the ground begins to return to what it was. A god arriving as a cuckoo in a storm on a mountain to be taken up by the goddess he intends to marry carries in that image the specific quality of a spring that is just beginning, cold still, uncertain still, but arriving. The marriage that followed, in whatever location the tradition chose to place it, was understood to have a double character. It was specific and historical. In the mythological sense, a thing that happened between these two figures at this moment in divine history, witnessed by these gods and celebrated with these gifts. And it was also ongoing, perpetual, renewed by ritual and by the persistence of the sanctuaries that housed it, by the willow at the bank of the Embrasos, and the cuckoo on the scepter, and the peacock that moved through the temple grounds of Hera's great sanctuaries, with all its eyes in feather pattern open to the light. The tradition regarding the golden apples allows one more rest before moving past it. The garden at the western edge of the world, its late afternoon permanence, its tree and its serpent, and its daughters of evening tending what does not require tending, so much as watching, was established at the wedding and never moved. Long after the wedding had become ancient history within the mythology itself, long after the stories that came after it had accumulated into the enormous body of Greek mythological tradition, the garden remained at the edge, the Hesperides remained at their post. Ladon remained coiled at the roots of the apple tree, and the apples remained on the tree, and the light in that part of the world remained the particular color of late afternoon, in a place where the afternoon does not end. The Horae, having stood at the gates of Olympus for the wedding procession, did not leave when the procession was finished. Their function was not temporary. They were associated with the gates because the gates needed what they represented, the ordering principle, the condition of right relation between the divine world and the world below it. They returned to their post. The gates continued. The structure continued. What the Greek religious tradition built around the marriage of Hera and Zeus was less a story with a fixed meaning than a network of images and practices and places that together constituted something too large to be contained in any single telling. The story told on Samos was not quite the same story told in Boeotia or at Argos, and none of these was quite the same as what Hesiod described or what the Homeric epics assumed. And the differences between them were not errors, but the natural condition of a tradition that had been developing across many communities and many centuries without a centralizing authority that determined which version was correct. What persisted across all versions was the marriage itself, the structure it created, the fact of it. Zeus was the king of heaven, Hera was his queen, the Horae stood at the gates, the golden tree stood at the edge of the world, the great sanctuaries stood on their hillsides and at their river mouths, their colonnades visible from the plains below, their rituals carrying the marriage forward from one year to the next, across more generations than any individual voice could count or name. The cuckoo is a small thing to carry so much, a bird that weighs almost nothing, that arrives with spring and calls through the warming air, and is associated across the Mediterranean world with the season's return. In the story, as the tradition holds it, the bird arrived in rain on a mountain in Boeotia, cold and hunched and very small, and the goddess who found it, whose name predated the fully developed mythology that would eventually account for her, whose cult was already ancient on the island of Samos and on the terraced hillsides of the Argolid, who presided over the whole arc of women's lives, from girlhood to marriage to widowhood. That goddess closed her hands around the cold, wet bird and held it against her warmth. Out of that simple act, the tradition builds a world, not because the act was a trick, though it was also a trick, but because what the act revealed, the capacity for compassion in the cold, the willingness to shelter something helpless and shivering and apparently ordinary, was a quality that the tradition considered worth being the beginning of something very large. The marriage of the two greatest figures in the Olympian pantheon carried on the back of a small wet bird and the ordinary human instinct to protect a creature in distress. On Samos, every year, Hera left her temple and came back to it. The statue was carried to the shore and dressed in fresh linen and returned. The Imbrasos moved past its banks in the same direction it had always moved, toward the sea, toward the open Aegean, toward the edge of the world where the Hesperides kept their patient watch beside the apple tree. The willow grew at the root of the sanctuary. The old stone of the colonnade stood in its long, incomplete row, column after massive column catching the morning light from the east, where the Aegean lay quiet in the early hours, and the birds that lived near the river moved through the reed beds without any particular urgency. The golden apple tree stood in its garden at the western edge of the world, in the particular light of a late afternoon that had not ended. The serpent Ladon lay at the tree's roots in a long, unbroken coil, his scales the color of old bronze or old water, his vigilance distributed evenly over every hour of a guardianship that had begun as a wedding gift and continued long past the wedding into the permanent present of a myth that has not stopped being told. The Hesperides moved nearby, or rested nearby, or simply remained nearby in the way that mythological figures remain in the places assigned to them, present, unhurried, doing what they were set to do at the moment the world arranged itself into the shape it held. 3 daughters of evening in a garden at the edge of things, tending a tree that needed no tending beyond their presence beside it. The light in the garden, the color of late gold, the apples on the branches, the color of the light, and the light never changing, the garden persisting in the particular patience of something given once and left to continue on its own, a gift that outlasted the occasion that created it and kept its quality in the long, still air at the far western edge of the world where the ordinary day did not reach, and the evening had been arriving for as long as anyone had thought to look in that direction. A white heifer stood in the long grass of the Argive plain, completely still, in the late afternoon light. The sanctuary of Hera rose behind her on the terraced hillside, its columns pale against the sky, and the ordinary sounds of that hour moved around her: wind in the grass, a distant bird, the low hum of the countryside going about its particular business, and none of it touched the animal standing alone in all that gold and green. She had been a priestess. The tradition holds that her name was Io, that she had served the great sanctuary visible on the slope behind her, and that the god of the sky had loved her, and that what followed from that love had brought her here, to the plains she may once have crossed on ordinary errands, now wearing a different shape entirely and unable to say so. The myth of Io is one of the oldest threads in the long account of Zeus and the mortal and divine figures he pursued across his reign. In Aeschylus's tragedy Prometheus Bound, the wandering Io encounters the Titan Prometheus chained to his rock, and what passes between them is a meeting of two kinds of suffering: the god punished for giving fire, and the woman transformed and driven without rest across the breadth of the known world. Whether the transformation was Zeus's act of concealment or Hera's act of recognition depends on which version of the tradition one follows. Some accounts say Zeus transformed Io into a heifer himself, hoping to hide his love from his wife before she could discover it. Others say Hera arrived at the precise moment of discovery, and that the transformation was her own swift work, the punishment and the disguise folded into a single gesture. Both versions agree on what the Hera looked like standing in the Argive plain: white and very still, and entirely alone in the ordinary light of a place she had known before. She knew too much. What Zeus had wanted in loving Io is not something the tradition dwells on at length. He was the king of the gods, and Io was a priestess of his wife at the most important sanctuary in the Argolid, and whatever the precise arrangement of desire and choice involved, the result was the same: a woman changed into an animal, left in the landscape of her former life, unable to speak in any language her companions could understand. The story does not need a narrator to declare it strange. The strangeness is in the image itself, in the animal standing so close to the place of worship, in the unchanged ground all around her, in the continued movement of ordinary time, through a situation that was entirely not ordinary. Io would not stay in the Argive plain. The tradition sends her far from Greece, across sea and continent, through lands that bore names the Greek world applied to the edges of its geographical imagination. Her wandering carried her through what the ancient sources describe as Scythia, and through the Caucasus, where she met the bound Prometheus on his rock, and eventually down into Egypt, where the story resolves in a way the earlier episodes do not quite prepare for. In Egypt, the wandering stopped. Eurydice was restored to her original form, and there she gave birth to a son named Epaphus, and the tradition records a lineage descending from that birth that would eventually include figures central to Greek mythology, a genealogical thread running from a white heifer on a Greek plain down into centuries of story. The Nile Delta, in this version of things, received what the Argive plain could not hold. Whatever Io had been before her transformation, she became something else in Egypt, and the myth stays with that transformation rather than fully undoing it. Semele was a Theban princess, daughter of Cadmus, who had founded Thebes itself in the older tradition by following a cow until it lay down and building his city where the animal rested, and of Harmonia, whose name the tradition held as the daughter of Ares and Aphrodite. The lineage is worth noting, not because it explains what happened to Semele, but because it establishes the world she inhabited, a city founded through divine instruction, a family already touched by the attention of gods, a woman who grew up in Thebes while the great stories of that city were still accumulating around her. Zeus loved her. The tradition does not record how the affair began, only what it contained and what it produced, which was the god Dionysus, carried in Semele's womb and growing slowly toward a birth that the myth treats as one of the most consequential in the Olympian account. The destruction of Semele came from an oath. Zeus, who loved her, swore on the river Styx, an oath no god could break or qualify after the words were spoken, that he would grant whatever she asked. The river Styx ran through the underworld, and its waters were the substance by which even Olympian promises were made absolute, the one medium in which the king of the gods and the least of the immortals were equally bound. Whatever Zeus intended when he swore that oath, the words were already irreversible by the time Semele spoke her request. She asked to see him as he truly was, not as the figure who came to her in a recognizable form, but in his full divine manifestation, the one the tradition reserved for his appearances as the Lord of heaven and lightning. The oath was already given, it could not be unmade, and the full manifestation of a god of that scale was not something a mortal body could withstand. Semele was destroyed by it, not attacked, not struck down in anger, but simply undone by proximity to a thing too large for her to survive. What the tradition does not allow to be destroyed was Dionysus. The unborn child, not yet a body in the full sense, was carried by Zeus from the fire of Semele's destruction and sewn into his own thigh, an image that every version of the myth dwells on with a certain careful attention, because what it describes is unusual, even within a tradition already accustomed to unusual births. The divine child continued to grow inside the king of the gods, held in the flesh of his leg, carried in a body that was not a womb toward a birth that the myth treats as entirely valid, the second birth that would give Dionysus one of his epithets, the twice-born. When the time came, Zeus opened his thigh, and the god of wine and wilderness and transformed consciousness emerged, and what had begun in a room in Thebes was completed on Olympus in a fashion no one in Thebes had planned. The ash and silence where Semele had been was one end of the story. The perfectly viable god arriving in the world was the other. The distance between them is what the myth asks its listener to hold. Alcmene was from Mycenae, a woman whose name the tradition connects to strength, and she had a husband named Amphitryon, a soldier away on a military campaign when Zeus came to her. The detail the myth dwells on is not the disguise itself. Zeus taking Amphitryon's exact form, his face and his voice, and the particular way he moved, but the length of the night in which the encounter took place. The tradition holds that Zeus extended the night to 3 times its ordinary duration, asking Helios to delay the sun so that the darkness lingered past every usual sign of dawn. The stars outside Alcmene's window did not move toward morning at the expected hour. The roosters that should have called out the changing time stayed quiet. The sky held its darkness for longer than any sky ought to hold it, and in that unnaturally extended dark, Alcmene lay with the figure she believed to be her husband, and Heracles was conceived. When the real Amphitryon returned, Alcmene lay with him also, and from that ordinary night, ordinary in its length, ordinary in every respect, came Iphicles, the mortal twin. The 2 boys were born together, but were not the same. The tradition knew them as brothers, who shared a mother and a cradle, and an early childhood, but who were made of different material, who had come into existence through completely different circumstances, and whose lives would diverge in ways that the myth tracks with great care across dozens of later episodes. Superfecundation, The conception of twins from different fathers within a single pregnancy was known to the Greek tradition as a rare but comprehensible event. The myth uses it not as a curiosity, but as a structural foundation. Heracles needed to be fully the son of Zeus, half divine in the specific way the tradition required, and the existence of his mortal twin provided the contrast that made the distinction felt. Two boys in one cradle, and only one of them destined to perform the 12 labors. The myth puts that side by side and lets the difference speak for itself. Alcmene's situation after the births was not an easy one. The tradition treats her with more complexity than it treats many of the women involved in Zeus's affairs. She had been deceived by a god who wore the exact face of her husband, and she was then required to raise the child of that deception alongside the ordinary son she had also borne, in a household that would soon come under the specific attention of Hera. She did not choose any of the conditions she found herself inside, and what the myth records of her afterward shows a woman who navigated a situation made by divine choices, in which she had played only the role of occasion, and who survived it with a clarity that the tradition seems to have found worth preserving. Leto was a Titan, daughter of the earlier generation, and when Zeus loved her, she was carrying the children who would become two of the most significant Olympian gods: Artemis, goddess of the hunt and the moon, and the lives of women in the wild and in childbirth, and Apollo, god of the sun and music and prophecy and the clarity of the archer's eye. What Leto needed was ground firm enough to stand on, stable enough to support a birth, willing enough to receive her, and in that last quality, the tradition records, the problem was absolute. Every landmass the earth contained refused, the islands refused, the promontories refused. The coastlines and the highlands and the broad plains of the mainland all returned the same answer. In some versions of the account, the earth itself was under instruction not to receive her. In others, every piece of land on earth was simply too afraid of Hera's displeasure to offer what Leto needed. The result was the same, regardless of the reason. A Titan carrying two Olympian children walked or swam, or was carried across a world that would not let her stop. Delos was the exception, and the tradition records the island's reasoning with the particular texture of a place that had nothing to protect, and therefore nothing to lose. The island was small and poor and rootless. It did not stay in one place the way other islands did, but floated in the Aegean without being anchored to the sea floor, an unattached and wandering patch of rock that the tradition names as one of the most unpromising places in the Cyclades. It had no particular status to endanger. It had no wealth to jeopardize. Hera's anger could not diminish something that was already at the bottom of every scale by which the Greek world measured desirability. Delos agreed. The floating island received the wandering goddess on its bare and rocky surface, and Leto, after 9 days and 9 nights of labor, finally delivered her children there. The birth of Artemis came first, and then, because the goddess of childbirth had been detained on Olympus and could not attend, the labor for Apollo extended for those 9 days without resolution. In some versions, Eileithyia was eventually smuggled to the island by the other goddesses, who brought her away from Olympus with the distraction of a necklace of amber and gold. When she arrived and the obstacle to the birth was removed, Leto gripped the trunk of a palm tree and delivered the god of light and prophecy into the particular morning light of the Aegean, the tradition giving Apollo's arrival a physical specificity that most divine births do not receive: the palm tree, the grip, the island, the light above the water. Apollo was born on Delos, the myth says, and the island that had floated rootless through its entire prior existence was at that moment fixed to the floor of the sea, held in place by something the tradition treats as permanent, the sacred weight of the birth it had agreed to receive. What Delos became afterward is inseparable from what it agreed to in that moment. The island that had been the least desirable in the Aegean became one of the most holy. Its sanctuary of Apollo grew across centuries into one of the most important religious sites in the Greek world, visited by delegations and pilgrims from across the Aegean and beyond. The small, bare, floating rock that said yes when every other piece of land said no was transformed by that answer into something central, and the transformation was permanent in the exact way the island's fixity was permanent, neither reversible nor gradual, but complete at the moment of decision. The tradition places enormous weight on that quality of the story, and it is easy to see why. What the island had was precisely nothing. What it received by offering that nothing was everything the tradition could give. Ganymede was a Trojan prince, and both the Iliad and the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite describe him as the most beautiful of mortal men, a quality the tradition names plainly and without elaboration, as though it were a physical fact like height or the color of his hair, something anyone present would have confirmed. He was on the Trojan plain, or tending his father's horses on a hillside near Troy, or simply somewhere in the landscape of the Troad when the eagle came. The tradition in its various versions agrees on the eagle, on the altitude, and on the destination. What Ganymede saw from the air is the image the myth rests on, the Aegean below him, the long curve of the coast of Anatolia growing small as the altitude increased, the particular blue of the sea at a height from which no ship or swimmer was visible, the world he had grown up inside, becoming a shape he could not have previously imagined it had. The eagle that carried Ganymede was sent by Zeus, or was Zeus himself transformed, depending on which version the tradition follows. The destination was Olympus, and the role waiting there was that of cupbearer to the gods, a position of proximity and honor, one that placed Ganymede at the center of divine hospitality and kept him in the company of immortals, for whom time worked entirely differently than it had in Troy. The tradition records that Zeus gave Ganymede's father divine horses, or a golden vine of extraordinary craftsmanship, as compensation for the boy's removal. The compensation was accepted. It stands in the myth as one of those exchanges in which the two parties involved were not operating with the same understanding of what had been lost and what the offered gift was worth. The father receiving something remarkable and permanent, holding in his hands an object that would outlast the ordinary measurement of mortal wealth, while somewhere above the clouds his son was pouring wine for gods who would remember him across a duration his father could not conceive. The tradition gives Ganymede immortality alongside his role. He did not age on Olympus. He did not experience the gradual change of mortal time, the way it shortens and quickens and eventually arrives at its border. The youth who was carried up from the Troad remained the youth who had been carried up from the Troad, and the myth records this as a gift, even as it records everything else about the circumstance that was not a gift at all. The tradition is not confused about what happened to Ganymede. It holds the beauty of the boy, and the will of the god, and the grief of the father, and the immortality at the end of all of it in the same account, without resolving any of the tensions between them, and perhaps that is the most honest thing about it, the refusal to close what the story itself left open. Across all of these accounts, the pattern that emerges is one of encounters between the divine and the mortal, that the mortal could not have prepared for, could not have deflected, and could not have fully survived intact. Io was transformed, Semele was destroyed, and her child was born elsewhere from an impossible second womb. Alcmene lay with a god wearing her husband's face on a night that the sun refused to end. Leto walked across a world that would not stop for her through 9 days of labor before a floating island in the Aegean agreed to hold her still. Ganymede was lifted from the plain and set in the company of immortals at a height above every world he had been raised to navigate. The tradition does not present these as equivalent experiences or as simple variations on a single theme. Each has its own texture, its own geographical specificity, its own figure of grief, or transformation, or strange resolution. What the myths share is not a moral, but a condition. The presence of Zeus in a story changes everything about the story's temperature and its outcome, not always toward destruction. Apollo and Artemis arrived on a fixed island and changed its entire history. Heracles was born with enough strength to strangle serpents in his cradle. Dionysus was born twice, which is not something most figures in any tradition can claim. Ganymede drank from a permanent youth that no war or sickness could reach. The tradition holds all of these alongside the suffering, the heifer wandering, the 9 nights of labor, the ash where Semele had been, and does not adjudicate between them, because adjudication is not what myth was built for. Myth was built to carry the whole shape of a thing across time, and the whole shape of these encounters includes both what was given and what was taken without asking. There is a genealogical vastness to the world these stories produced. Heracles would perform 12 labors that the tradition treats as the organizing principle of the Greek heroic age. Apollo would sit in his sanctuary at Delphi and speak prophecy through the Pythia to delegations from across the ancient world for centuries. Artemis would range across every wilderness the Greek imagination could picture, and her sanctuary at Ephesus would become one of the architectural wonders of the ancient world. Dionysus would be worshipped across Greece and beyond. His rituals and his festivals and his theatrical traditions leaving marks on the culture that are still visible. From a white heifer standing in a field, from a night 3 times too long, from 9 days of labor on a floating island, from an eagle rising from the Troad with a boy in its grip. From all of this came a generation of divine and half-divine figures whose stories the tradition told for as long as it told any stories at all. The Argive plain, where Io had stood, lay quiet in the afternoon light of whatever afternoon came after the myths moved on. The grass grew in the same long lines. The wind moved through it in the same direction. The sanctuary on the terraced hillside above it remained on its terraced hillside, its columns pale against the sky. At any hour, the sun was up, visible from the plain below, in exactly the way that very large things built in very particular places are always visible to anyone crossing the ground at their feet. Io was gone from the plain by then. The tradition had sent her east and south, through landscapes with strange names, toward Egypt and a restoration and a sun. What remained where she had stood was just the grass and the light, and the ordinary sound of the country in the afternoon. The island of Delos floated in the Aegean for as long as the tradition can say, bare and poor and unanchored, offering nothing to anyone who had something to protect. In the moment that Leto gripped the palm tree and Apollo arrived into the light above the water, the island stopped moving. The stone roots touched the floor of the sea for the first time. The Aegean water shifted above the place where something had just become fixed, a small disturbance in the surface, the kind that closes over itself in a few seconds and leaves no evidence behind. From above, the island looked exactly as it had looked when it was floating. From below, for the first time, it was held. The palm tree stood in the same place it had always stood on the island's small surface, its bark warm from the Aegean sun, its roots now resting on ground that was not going anywhere. Around it, the sea moved as it had always moved, indifferent to what had just happened beneath it, carrying its light across the water in the long familiar way. The peacock's tail, when it spreads fully in the light, does not look like one thing. It looks like 100 small things watching at once, each eye in the pattern, and there are 100 of them, one for each of the eyes that once belonged to Argus Panoptes, catches the angle of the sun slightly differently from the one beside it, so that the whole spread fan shimmers and shifts as though something behind it is breathing. The Greeks understood this to be Hera's design. The bird was hers, the watching was hers, and what had once been the vigilance of a single enormous guardian, posted at the edge of a pasture to watch one particular heifer who had once been a woman, was now distributed permanently across the feathers of the goddess's own sacred creature, carried with her colt wherever it settled, visible in the afternoon light of every sanctuary that received it. The story of Argus begins with an ending. He was assigned his post after Hermes had not yet arrived. For a time, the 100-eyed giant stood his watch faithfully, some of his eyes sleeping, never all of them at once, so that the heifer Io was never fully unobserved, regardless of the hour or the light. Io grazed. Argus watched. The plain around the sanctuary at Argos stretched away in all directions, ordinary and wide, and the figure of the giant at the edge of the field was simply part of the landscape for as long as his vigil lasted. What Hera had built was a perfectly closed arrangement, a watch that could not be slept through, a guard without a blind side, a prison that did not look like a prison from the outside, because the prisoner was a heifer standing in a field. Hermes came under orders. He came dressed as a shepherd, and he came with music, and he came with the kind of slow and unhurried stories that ease a listener into a state of not quite sleeping, and not quite waking, and not quite noticing that the boundary between the two has stopped being distinct. One by one, across the long telling, the eyes of Argus closed. Some of the traditions say the instrument was a set of panpipes. Some say it was the sound of the reed itself, playing something particular and low. What all the versions agree on is the quality of the effect, a heaviness settling across each pair of eyes in turn. The music working through the giant, the way deep water works, slowly and completely, until the last eyes finally closed, and Argus Panoptes, the all-seeing, was no longer seeing anything at all. Hermes killed him then. The traditions differ slightly on the instrument, a sword in some versions, a stone in others, but they agree on the result. The giant fell. And Hera, when she understood what had happened, did not simply grieve the loss of her most useful guard. She gathered what Argus had been, or the most important part of it, and she redistributed it. The 100 eyes went into the tail of the peacock. The vigilance continued, transformed. This is the kind of act the tradition consistently records in Hera's name, not a single action completed and then set aside, but a pattern adjusted, relocated, made permanent in a different form. What she had used once, she kept. What she had lost, she reinvented. And the heifer Io was still alive, still transformed, and Hera's attention was no longer limited to one giant standing in one field. The gadfly came next. It is described in the tradition as an instrument of maddening, a creature sent not to harm Io in the way a predator harms prey, but to torment, to drive, to keep the heifer moving with no rest and no direction that she chose for herself. Aeschylus has Io describe her own wandering in Prometheus Bound, the play in which she encounters the bound Titan, and he maps for her the enormous geography of what remains of her journey. Across the water, across the land that will eventually bear her name, into Egypt, where the madness will finally end, and where Zeus will restore her to human form with a touch. The wandering covers the whole of the known world, and then some of what lay beyond it. Io moves through it as something between a refugee and a wound, exhausted and unable to stop, the gadfly behind her, always when she slows. What the tradition is doing in these images is something worth sitting with for a moment, in the way one sits with an image seen in a mosaic before moving along the wall. Hera does not pursue Io herself. She does not appear in the field and do what needs to be done directly. Instead, she builds a system, a watcher, then a tormentor, then a vast geographic displacement that takes Io so far from Argos that the heifer who had been a priestess stands eventually at the edge of the Nile, surrounded by the reeds and the dark soil of a country that is not Greece. Having crossed a route that later Greeks would trace on maps and name for what she suffered there, the Bosphorus, the Ford of the Cow, the Ionian Sea. The tradition threaded Io's flight through the geography of the world, and the geography stayed marked by it. The gadfly drove her, and the world received the names of where she had been. The disguise that Hera wore to visit Semele in Thebes was the most careful of her transformations. She took the form of Beroe, an old woman from Epidaurus, who had been Semele's nurse, a figure already known to the young woman, already trusted, already woven into the texture of ordinary daily life so thoroughly that her presence in a room required no explanation. Some time passed between the first visit and the question, "That is important." Hera, in the shape of Beroe, did not arrive and immediately begin her work. She sat with Semele, she listened, she built the kind of familiar, comfortable intimacy that an old nurse accumulates with a young woman over years of ordinary conversation, the kind of closeness that makes a suggestion feel like wisdom rather than manipulation, because it arrives wrapped in affection and comes from a voice the listener has always found trustworthy. The question, when it finally came, was simple, or it was shaped to seem simple. If Zeus truly loved her, should he not be willing to prove it? If this divine lover was genuine, should he not be willing to appear as he appeared before the other gods, not in the disguised, reduced, mortal, tolerable form he had been taking in her presence, but in his full reality? Semele was pregnant with Dionysus. She was young, and she was loved, and she had no reason to think the old woman beside her was anything other than what she appeared to be. She asked Zeus the question. She framed it as a request. She had, before he could respond, extracted from him the oath, sworn on the river Styx, the one oath in the Greek tradition that even the king of the gods could not break without consequences more serious than the keeping of it. The oath committed Zeus to grant whatever she desired. What she desired, now that the question had been so carefully planted, was to see him as he truly was. The rest the tradition describes quickly, because it happens quickly. The full divine manifestation of Zeus, the real presence of a god who held thunder, who was associated with the actual force of lightning in the sky, could not be survived by mortal flesh. Semele was destroyed. The unborn Dionysus was removed, and Zeus carried the child to term himself, stitching the infant into his own thigh, where the god of wine and transformation continued to develop until the second birth was possible. The disguise Hera had worn departed the story the moment Semele made her request. Beroe had never been anywhere, and what had sat in that room in Thebes, asking careful questions across an interval of established trust, had been the queen of Olympus, and the work had been finished before anyone named it. The two serpents arrived at night. This is the detail that the tradition is consistent about. Not during the day, not in any moment when the household was already alert and gathered. They came in darkness into the room where the infant Heracles lay in his cradle, and the tradition places their coming in the hour when a household is most itself at rest, when the gap between what is expected and what is actually present is widest. Hera had sent them. They were great serpents. The specific descriptions vary across sources. Some of the traditions give them particular qualities, associations, attributes that make them more than simply large snakes sent on a mission. What matters is their size and their purpose. They were not small animals that an infant might accidentally dislodge. They were sent to complete something specific, and they came at the hour when that completion seemed most guaranteed. What they found instead was an infant who had woken. Pindar describes it in the first Nemean ode, and the image has persisted across centuries of Attic vase painting, which means that the Greeks returned to this particular moment with enough frequency to make it a fixed point in their visual imagination. The infant Heracles awake in the dark in his cradle with a serpent in each hand, not one serpent, two, both held at arm's length, both controlled with the grip of a child who had not yet learned to speak, both held still before the household had fully registered that something had gone wrong in the night. The nurse screamed. Amphitryon came running with a sword, which was not needed. Alchemy arrived to find her infant son holding two large dead serpents with the mild expression of someone who has just finished a task that seemed to him entirely manageable. The tradition uses this moment as a disclosure. What the two serpents revealed by arriving and failing was the nature of what they had been sent against. A child who kills two great serpents in his cradle with his bare hands before the household wakes is not a child who is going to be easy to destroy. Hera had already delayed his birth, using Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth, kept in place on Olympus, with arms folded and legs crossed in the specific posture the tradition associated with binding and preventing the bodily posture of obstruction, performed by the goddess whose function was the opposite. That delay had cost Heracles his inheritance. The precedence that Zeus had intended for him had gone to Eurystheus, arriving first because Eileithyia had been detained and Alcmene's labor had been held. All of that had already been accomplished, and still Hera sent the serpents, because what had been taken from Heracles in terms of birthright had not resolved the fact of his existence. The infant lay in the cradle with the two motionless serpents still in his hands, and the household gathered in the doorway of the room. Amphitryon, in Pindar's telling, called the seer Tiresias to interpret the night's events. Tiresias looked at the child and the dead serpents and spoke plainly about what they meant, not as a warning, not as something that required correction, but as a disclosure. The child was what he was. The serpents had demonstrated it more clearly than any announcement could have. Tiresias described the life ahead of Heracles with the particular patience of a seer who understands that the person being described is not going to find the account easy, but who knows that accuracy serves better than comfort in these matters. There is something to notice in the way Hera's campaign against Heracles runs. It begins before he is born, with the delay imposed on Alcmene, with the acceleration of Eurystheus's arrival, and it continues into his infancy with the serpents, and it will not stop there. But the tradition does not describe Hera's attention to Heracles as single-minded or obsessive in the ordinary sense. It is more like a sustained constitutional feature of his life, the pressure against which everything he does is measured. He is the strongest man who has ever lived, and part of the reason the tradition keeps insisting on that is that the pressure he operates under is the pressure of a divine queen who does not abandon a project, and what he accomplishes against that pressure is the scale against which his strength is registered. Eileithyia, sitting on Olympus with her arms folded and her knees pressed together, deserves her own moment of attention. She was the goddess of childbirth, or one of the goddesses of childbirth, depending on the source, since some traditions give the role to a single figure and others to a plurality. Her name is connected to the coming, to the arrival, to the act of bringing forth. The bodily posture the tradition assigned to her as a method of obstruction, arms clasped, legs crossed, body closed against the idea of opening, was understood to act sympathetically on the labor it was meant to prevent. If the goddess of birth made her own body into the shape of not birth, labor could be stalled. The logic is coherent within the tradition's own understanding of how divine figures interact with the processes they govern. Hera kept her daughter in that posture. This is an unusual arrangement, even within the tradition's broad catalog of divine coercions. It is a mother directing a daughter to perform a sustained physical act against her own nature and function, for as long as Alcmene's labor needed to be held. The tradition does not record Eileithy's response to these instructions, or whether she found them straightforwardly acceptable or difficult. What it records is the effect: 9 days of labor for Leto on Delos, waiting through pain for the arrival of a goddess who had been detained, and the interrupted labor of Alcmene, held extended until Eurystheus could be born ahead of the child the king of the gods had intended for prominence. 2 women in labor, both affected by the same goddess's absence from her function. Gallant, who was Alcmene's servant, resolved the obstruction through deception. She ran out of the house and announced to the gods who were present and working to delay the birth that Alcmene had already delivered successfully. The Moirai, the Fates, and Eileithyia, startled into uncrossing their positions by the announcement, effectively released the obstruction before anyone had thought through whether the announcement was true. It was not true, but the posture broke, and the labor resumed, and Heracles was born shortly after. Eileithyia punished Galanthus for the trick. The servant was transformed. But Heracles had been born, and the delay that had stolen his precedence was already done, and could not be undone by any subsequent act. And what followed was the life the tradition inherited, the labors, the wandering, the enormous span of what one human being accomplished against the opposition of the most powerful goddess on Olympus. The madness that fell on Heracles in Euripides' tragedy arrived in his adult life, after the labors had been assigned and performed and survived. Iris and Lyssa, the goddess of the rainbow, serving as messenger, and Lyssa as the personification of rabid fury, came to the house where Heracles lived with his wife Megara and their children. Lyssa, in the Euripidean text, is actually reluctant. She argues against the task. She lists the virtues of Heracles, his piety, his usefulness to the gods, the things he has done that deserve different treatment. Eris does not negotiate. The madness was sent because Hera had ordered it, and the ordering of it by Hera was sufficient authority for the mission to proceed, regardless of Lyssa's reservations. The fit, when it descended on Heracles, operated through exactly the mechanism that makes it most terrible within the tradition's own logic. He could not tell the difference between his enemies and his family. The arrows that had killed monsters, that had performed 12 labors requiring strength and skill and endurance beyond the ordinary range of human capacity, those arrows were still his arrows, and his aim was still his aim, and the madness directed it all inward. He killed Megara. He killed the children. By the time Athena stopped the fit, striking him with a stone in some versions, simply appearing in the tradition as the force that ended it, the household was already destroyed. Heracles woke from the madness into the knowledge of what he had done. Euripides handles this with the specific gravity of tragedy, which is not the same register as the broader mythological tradition, But the fact of what happened, the death of his children, the death of Megara, the oracle at Delphi, directing him to serve Eurystheus in penance, runs through the tradition in all its versions. The 12 labors that are the central trunk of the Heracles myth have their origin here in the penance assigned by the oracle at Delphi for killing his own family in a divinely induced madness. The same Eurystheus whose precedents Hera had engineered by detaining Eileithyia became the king Heracles was required to serve, completing a structure that had been designed before the hero's birth and that continued to shape his life decades after the first intervention. There is a quality to the way Hera's actions unfold across the Heracles tradition that the tradition itself does not fully explain, but that becomes visible when the episodes are held together at once. She delays his birth to redirect his inheritance. She sends serpents to kill him as an infant. She induces the madness that destroys his family and sets the penance that defines the central arc of his life. She is not simply opposing Heracles in the way an enemy opposes a hero. She is shaping the conditions of his heroism, creating the specific obstacles and losses and penance assignments that make him what the tradition needed him to be. This is not an observation the myth asks the listener to make. It is simply something that sits in the arrangement of the episodes, quiet and visible, if the episodes are placed beside each other and considered unhurriedly. The peacock in Hera's sanctuaries walked in the light that fell between the columns, its tail dragging across the warm stone of the precinct floors. The 100 eyes in its feathers had been watching in that particular way since the death of Argus, distributed, present, catching the light from 100 slightly different angles at once. The bird was ordinary in the sense that all sacred animals in the tradition are ordinary, visible, physical, present in the world at the specific location of the sanctuary, eating what it ate, moving how it moved, entirely recognizable as a peacock to anyone who encountered it, and also something else entirely to anyone who knew whose eyes those were and how they had arrived there. Hera's sacred bird carried the memory of her most comprehensive guardian in a form that could not be killed the way Argus had been killed. Hermes could not lull a peacock's tail to sleep with pipe music. The eyes were no longer eyes in the functional sense. They could not report, could not see in the way Argus had seen, could not close one at a time to rest while the others remained open and vigilant. They were eyes in the symbolic sense, which in the tradition's framework is a different kind of presence, and in some respects a more permanent one. Argus Panoptes, all-seeing, had been mortal in the way the tradition's giants were mortal, capable of death, capable of being tricked and overcome. What Hera had made of him afterward was not mortal in the same way. It was woven into the feathers of a bird that would be bred and kept and regarded as sacred across the entire run of her cult's existence. The variety of what Hera employed across these episodes is worth noticing. She used giants and gadflies, and disguised voices, and divine postures, and messengers, and the personification of madness itself. She worked across time scales. Some of her interventions were immediate, some were structural arrangements that took decades to produce their full effect. She worked through direct agents, and through intermediaries, and through the careful management of other people's relationships with people she wished to affect. She withheld a goddess from her function. She sent a goddess to another goddess to borrow a necessary attribute. She spent time in a room with a young woman, becoming known and trusted before asking the question that was the whole point of the visit. The tradition records all of this not as the acts of a monster, but as the acts of the most powerful goddess on Olympus, conducting the business of her particular grievances with the full range of tools available to her. The Io, who eventually arrived in Egypt, had been transformed and tormented across a geography so large that the Greeks mapped it. Aeschylus has Prometheus tell her exactly where she will go, in a speech that covers the Caucasus and the Cimmerian shores, and the straits and the Asian steppe, and eventually the Nile. And the precision of the geography is part of the tradition's way of taking seriously what Io endured. The place names that recorded her flight were not incidental. They were the tradition's way of saying that the wandering was real enough to leave permanent marks on the world, that a priestess transformed and driven across the earth by a queen's sustained attention left an impression that outlasted both the suffering and the resolution. Io was restored in Egypt. She bore Epaphus, who was the ancestor of Heracles, which means that the line of Zeus's children by mortal women loops back through the figure Hera had tormented across the full width of the known world before the hero who would draw Hera's longest attention was even conceived. It is difficult to say within the tradition's own terms when Hera considered any particular campaign complete. The transformation of Io was ultimately reversed. The serpents sent to the cradle were killed by the infant before the mission was done. The madness of Heracles was ended by Athena. Even the detention of Eileithyia was eventually broken by the servant's trick, the posture releasing before the plan was completed. What the tradition records is not a series of complete victories, but a series of sustained pressures, each of which shaped something, altered something, redirected something, without, in any case, simply ending the thing it was aimed against. Dionysus was born, Heracles was born, and spent his life in servitude to Eurystheus, and died eventually on Mount Olympus in the tradition's own reckoning of his end. The image that the tradition keeps returning to across the full scope of what Hera did in response to what Zeus had done is the image of sustained attention, not rage that burns quickly and then is gone, not grief that runs its course and resolves. Something older and slower than both of those, the particular quality of a goddess whose domain encompassed the full span of a woman's life, from girlhood to widowhood, who understood duration in a way that the more transient forms of divine feeling do not, and who applied that understanding to everything she set herself against. The gadfly behind Io kept her moving. The labor extended across 9 days by a daughter's detained posture. The careful weeks of building trust before the question that could not be unasked. These are the actions of someone for whom time is a resource, not a limit. The peacock walked in the precinct of the sanctuary, trailing its tail across the warm stone. Each eye in the feather pattern caught the afternoon light at its own angle. The 100-eyed giant, who had once stood in the field outside Argos, watching a heifer who had once been a priestess, had become this distributed across the feathers of a bird that would outlast the memory of the mission it was given, outlast the heifer it had watched, outlast the giant it had been, walking the grounds of sanctuaries from Argos to Samos in the particular unhurried way of a sacred animal that has no destination and no urgency, that simply moves through the light of the precinct for as long as the precinct stands. And somewhere in the same period that all of this was being conducted, the watching, the driving, the disguises, the detained goddesses, the serpents in the cradle, a child slept in a house in Thebes, in the temporary peace that came after the worst thing in his life had not quite happened yet. Both serpents were still, both serpents were dead. His hands, which had done it, were still open in the way that hands rest after closing. The household had gathered in the doorway and looked at what their night had almost contained, and at the child who had refused it, and at the confirmation that lay visible in the grip of someone who had not yet spoken his first word, sleeping now in the particular quiet that follows a danger that has passed without leaving a mark, the destiny already present in the hands at rest, the household still gathered, the night still going slowly through its final hours toward the ordinary morning that would come. On Olympus, in the stillness between one moment and the next, Zeus lay bound in rawhide thongs. The god who held the thunderbolt, who had scattered the Titans across the floor of Tartarus, who had swallowed a goddess whole to keep a prophecy from coming true, that god lay held against the floor of his own palace, the restraints cutting across his wrists and his chest, while somewhere in the corridors of the divine house, the conspirators stood and waited to see what would happen next. The rawhide was ordinary. That was perhaps the most interesting thing about it. Not golden chains, not some divine material forged by Hephaestus in the fires beneath the earth, but the kind of material anyone might have found, pressed into a use no one had imagined before. 3 gods had bound him. Hera was among them. The Iliad contains this episode only as a memory, told slantwise in anger. Zeus himself recalls it, or rather, Zeus throws it at Hera as evidence of what she is capable of. A detail surfaced in the middle of an argument and aimed with precision. Poseidon and Athena were with her in the conspiracy the tradition holds, which places this attempted coup among the most remarkable collaborations in the surviving mythology. The queen of the gods, the god of the sea, and the goddess of wisdom, working together in the dark against the king who sat above them all. What they intended to do once they had him is not recorded. The tradition does not say. What it does say is that Thetis, the sea nymph, mother of Achilles, a figure connected to the deep water rather than to Olympus, went below the surface of the sea and found the 100-handed Briareus, one of the Hecatonchyres, those enormous beings whose existence the tradition says predated the Olympian world itself. Briareus rose from the deep water. He came up through the sea and then up through the air and arrived at the threshold of Olympus, and when he stood in the doorway, the conspirators saw what was standing there and left the room. The coup did not proceed. Zeus was freed, and what had almost happened became the kind of thing that goes unresolved, not punished outright, not forgiven, not even named again in the surviving texts as a finished thing, but simply added to the long and accumulating record of what this marriage was between 2 powers, enormous enough that their conflicts required the oldest beings in the universe to settle. There is a specific physical texture to the image the tradition preserves. Zeus on the floor, the rawhide tight, and then the moment the door changed. Briareus does not speak in any surviving version. He stands. That appears to be sufficient. Some confrontations in the tradition do not require a word spoken, only the presence of something large enough that the room reorganizes itself around it, and the thing that was happening stops happening, and everyone involved is left to carry what almost occurred into the long quiet afterward. Zeus and Hera had been married since before the assembled mythology had found its final form. The courtship belonged to the slopes of Mount Kithaeron, to the image of a shivering bird held against a goddess's warmth. The wedding had been attended by the Horae, standing at the gates of Olympus, by the golden apple tree presented at the world's western edge, by the annual Samian ritual in which the goddess was retrieved from the shoreline and dressed again in fresh cloth and returned to her house. The marriage was not incidental to the tradition, it was structural to it, the central ordering relationship of the divine world, the hieros gamos, that priests and scholars and poets alike understood as the binding that held the cosmic arrangement in place. And within that binding, the tradition preserved this, a queen who had once helped fasten her husband to the floor of his own palace, and a king who remembered it, and both of them still in the same marriage, still occupying the same mountain, still conducting the largest argument in the Greek mythological inheritance. The punishment Zeus inflicted on Hera for one of her campaigns against his children is described in the Iliad with a specificity that stays. In the 15th book, Zeus recalls what he did when he learned that Hera had sent a storm to blow Heracles off course on his return from an earlier sack of Troy, a storm intended not merely to inconvenience the hero, but to strand him, to humiliate him, to undo what the sack had accomplished. Zeus hung her from the sky. The tradition says he bound her wrists with golden chains and fixed 2 heavy iron anvils to her feet, and then left her suspended between the heavens and the earth, somewhere above the clouds in the particular cold that exists above where weather lives. The contrast between the materials is present and deliberate in the text: gold at the wrists where the chains connected her to the sky, iron at the feet where the weight pulled her down, and between those two forces, the goddess hanging with nothing to stand on and nothing to hold. He told the other gods that if any of them came to help her, he would throw that god from Olympus, and the tradition holds that not one of them tried. Not Poseidon, who had been her co-conspirator, not Athena. The assembled gods of the Olympian house stood at a distance and did not move while the queen of the sky hung in the cold above the clouds. Whether Hera called out, the tradition does not record. Whether she wept, the tradition does not record. What survives is the image, the golden chains, the iron weight, the cold air, and the silence of every god watching from a respectable distance, none of them willing to bring the whole of Zeus's capacity for violence down on their own head. The punishment ended eventually. The tradition does not specify when or what condition was agreed upon, or whether Zeus released her, or whether she simply came down when the anvils were removed. What the myth preserves is the episode in its suspended state, as though the important thing is not its resolution, but its occurrence, the fact that it happened at all between two beings whose marriage was supposed to be the model of divine order. The other gods watched and said nothing. The anvils were iron, the chains were gold, and somewhere below all of it, the Aegean moved in ordinary patterns across an ordinary afternoon, and the world went about its business, while the Queen of Heaven hung above it in the cold. There are other places in the tradition where the balance of power between them reverses direction entirely, and the reversal is as thorough as what happened in the sky. In the 14th book of the Iliad, Hera conceived a plan that required 3 separate operations carried out in sequence, each one dependent on the last, each one involving the careful management of a different divine figure. She wanted to put Zeus to sleep, not as revenge precisely, or not only as revenge, but as a means of influencing the Trojan War. Zeus had decided that the Trojans would have certain successes in battle, and Hera wanted those successes to stop, while Zeus was briefly absent from consciousness. The plan required Aphrodite's kestos, the embroidered girdle said to hold within its fabric the concentrated power of love and longing and desire, and it required Hypnos, the god of sleep, and it required the summit of Mount Ida, where the operations could be carried out with Zeus close enough to the battlefield to feel the weight of his involvement, but removed enough from Olympus that the sleeping could happen without an audience. Hera approached Aphrodite and asked for the kestos on the grounds that she wanted to rekindle a domestic affection. The account she gave was of 2 figures whose old love had grown distant, and she wanted the girdle to repair it. Aphrodite, the tradition says, did not hesitate. She took the kestos from her own chest and gave it over, and Hera went from there to find Hypnos. The god of sleep was harder, He had been used once before in a similar operation, had put Zeus to sleep at Hera's request during an earlier episode, and Zeus had been angry enough afterward that Hypnos had fled to Night for protection, and Zeus, the tradition holds, had let it go rather than disturb Night herself with his pursuit. Hypnos was reluctant to risk that situation again. Hera offered him one of the Graces as a bride. Hypnos agreed. On the summit of Mount Ida, Hera approached Zeus, wearing the Kestos. The god looked at her and felt immediately the specific force of what the girdle carried. The tradition says he wanted her as much as he had wanted anything in the long catalog of his desires, and the list was long, and the feeling was still that strong. They lay together on the summit of the mountain. Zeus slept afterward. The particular complete sleep that Hypnos produces, not the ordinary sleep of a tired being, but the sleep of a god put under by divine intention, the kind of sleep in which nothing reaches the sleeper and nothing moves. The clouds gathered around the summit. Below on the plain the battle continued, and Poseidon moved through the Greek lines, while Zeus lay still above them, all on Ida, the Kestos nearby, the god of sleep somewhere in the branches of a fir tree, keeping watch. The plan worked in the short term. It was found out in the way these things always are found out in the tradition. Zeus woke, looked down at the battlefield, and understood immediately what had been arranged. The tradition preserves his anger, which was considerable, and his recitation to Hera of everything she had done before, including the storm that blew Heracles off course, including the binding on the floor of Olympus, the full accumulated account delivered with the specific force of a god who has been put to sleep on a mountainside by his wife for the fourth or fifth time and is remembering all the other times. Hera denied knowledge. The tradition has her swear on the river Styx, the inviolable oath that she had not instructed Poseidon. This was technically accurate. She had not instructed him directly. She had simply arranged the conditions in which he could act. The river Styx carries its own weight in the tradition. To swear on the Styx was to invoke a force older than the Olympian arrangement, a force outside the structure Zeus administered. The gods could lie to each other across the table of Olympus with relatively few consequences. To swear on the Styx and then break the oath was to invite a penalty the tradition describes as a year of unconsciousness, followed by 9 years of exile from the divine world, a punishment that would strip a god of the table of the gods for almost as long as the Titanomachy had lasted. Hera swore on the Styx. Her oath was carefully constructed. The tradition treats this without much comment, as though the difference between lying and speaking a technically accurate falsehood was a distinction any competent divine figure would have understood and employed. The manipulation of births was a different kind of operation, slower and more structural, and aimed not at an immediate battle, but at the shape of the coming decades. Zeus had made an oath, as he sometimes did in the tradition, without fully considering what the oath would require, that the next descendant of Perseus to be born would be the one who ruled over men. He meant Heracles. Alcmene was pregnant with Heracles, and the child would be Zeus's own son, and the oath was designed to clear the path ahead of him. Hera understood immediately what had been intended, and set about ensuring that what Zeus intended was not what would happen. Alcmene's labor was delayed. Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth, Hera's own daughter, was kept on Olympus, and even without the goddess's absence, the tradition preserves the image of Eileithyia sitting with her arms folded and her legs crossed. The specific bodily posture the tradition held could prevent a birth from proceeding, maintained deliberately, held in place, while far below on the earth, Alcmene labored through a night that was extending itself against the natural order. At the same time, the tradition records, Hera ensured that a different descendant of Perseus arrived first, Eurystheus, born prematurely and placed ahead of Heracles in the sequence that Zeus's oath now required to honor. Heracles was born into a world that had already allocated his precedence to someone else. The oath was unbreakable. What it promised went to Eurystheus, and it was Eurystheus who would eventually send Heracles on the 12 labors, a fact that traces directly back to this moment of manipulated timing. One birth slowed, one birth accelerated, and an oath held to its exact letter while its spirit was completely inverted. Zeus had sworn on the Styx. The oath was honored precisely. The tradition does not present this as a trick, exactly, or not only as a trick. It presents it as a demonstration of something about the space between an oath's language and its intention, and about what a sufficiently powerful and motivated goddess could do with the gap between those two things, working through the structures Zeus himself had established, using the inviolable machinery of divine obligation as the instrument of its own circumvention. Hephaestus was born in a different kind of operation entirely. The tradition holds, and specifically Hesiod in the Theogony holds, that Hera bore him without a father, parthenogenetically, as a deliberate response to Zeus producing Athena from his own head. Zeus had swallowed Metis when she was pregnant, absorbing the goddess into himself, and then, in the fullness of time, producing Athena fully armed from his skull when Hephaestus split it open with a hammer. This was, among its many other qualities, a complete severance of the maternal from the divine birth. A son of Zeus produced entirely from Zeus, owing nothing to a mother, belonging entirely to the Olympian king, in a way no child of a union could. Hera's response was to produce a son of her own, with the same logic applied in reverse, a child belonging entirely to her, produced from her alone, with no trace of Zeus in the lineage. Hephaestus was that child, and the myth does not leave him there as simply an interesting symmetry. The tradition goes further and preserves an episode in which Hephaestus sent a golden throne to Olympus, a piece of work so beautiful and so perfectly crafted that Hera sat down in it without suspicion, which was perhaps the truest tribute to his skill, that the quality of the craftsmanship defeated the caution that ought to have preceded it. The throne was a trap. Once Hera sat down in it, she could not stand up. The divine house on Olympus found itself in the position of containing a queen who could not leave her seat, and none of the available divine workmanship could undo what Hephaestus had made. Dionysus eventually persuaded Hephaestus to return to Olympus and release her. The tradition presents this as requiring considerable negotiation and wine. What the myth is doing at this point is worth sitting with. It has moved from Hera and Zeus in direct conflict to a son produced by Hera alone, acting without instruction, trapping his own mother in a chair of his own devising, and requiring the wine god's particular combination of persistence and intoxication to bring him back. The god produced to answer Zeus's unilateral birth became himself the source of an immobilization that the whole of Olympus could not undo. The tradition is not tidy on the subject of consequences. The golden throne stood in the divine house for however long these things lasted before Dionysus brought Hephaestus back. It is worth imagining, though the tradition does not dwell on it, what that period looked like. The immaculate craftwork, the queen caught inside it, the assembled gods of Olympus walking past at a respectful distance, not quite looking at her, in the same way they had not quite looked when she was hanging from the sky on golden chains. The tradition does not record what was said in the house during that interval. The tradition records the resolution and the immediate circumstances and leaves the middle space empty. There is a pattern across all of these episodes that the tradition does not announce but allows to accumulate slowly, the way a shape in stone becomes apparent only when a certain quality of light falls across it. Hera and Zeus did not fight the way mortals fought, with words and silences and the ordinary escalations of domestic conflict. They fought with the instruments of the divine world, oaths sworn on rivers that predated the Olympians, goddesses detained at the precise moments their functions were needed elsewhere, magical garments borrowed from the goddess of desire, the hundred-handed beings of the oldest creation, pulled up from below the sea. Each act was deployed within the rules of the divine order, or just adjacent to them, in the narrow space where what was technically permissible and what was intended diverged. Each act required knowledge of the other figure's capabilities, of the structure of divine obligation, of what could be undone and what could not. They had been doing this since before the mythology had settled into its final written form. They would continue doing it through every version the tradition produced, through the Homeric poems and the tragedies and the lyric poets and the local variations that each island and city and sanctuary maintained. The Samians celebrated the marriage annually, carrying the goddess to the shore and bringing her back. The Argive Plain held her oldest sanctuary. The peacock walked through the temple precincts, with its hundred-eyed tail trailing behind it. The cuckoo was carved on the top of the scepter. The apple tree stood at the western edge of the world with the serpent coiled at its base, and the Hesperides were somewhere nearby, in the fading light, and the gift had been given once and persisted. None of this was resolved. That is perhaps the most important structural fact the tradition preserves about this particular relationship. Not the binding, not the hanging, not the sleeping king on the mountain or the trapped queen in the golden chair, but the simple fact that none of it was settled. The marriage continued. Zeus continued. Hera continued. The conflict ran beneath the surface of every subsequent arrangement in the mythology, like a current beneath water, visible only when something disturbed the surface, and then clearly there, clearly moving, clearly old. The Herodon of Samos stands near the mouth of the Imbrazos River, close enough to the sea that the quality of the light around it has always been coastal. The particular pale brightness that comes off water and falls across stone and makes everything near the shore seem slightly more exposed than it would be elsewhere. The temple was one of the oldest in the Greek world. Its construction, the tradition suggests, went on for a very long time, in the way that the construction of something central to a community's understanding of itself tends to go on. Additions made, columns raised, the plan revised and expanded across generations, until the building itself became a kind of record of sustained intention. The double colonnade of massive columns was never fully completed. The building remained, in some sense, in progress. This is an ordinary fact about ancient architecture. Projects of this scale routinely exceeded the lifespans of the people who began them. But there is something in the image worth sitting with at this particular distance. The Hera of Samos, enormous, coastal, never quite finished, standing near the water for generations, its massive columns casting long shadows across the ground in the morning and the late afternoon, and changing the shadow's direction in the middle of the day, the sea nearby in every season, the Imbrazos River moving past it toward the Aegean, in the same direction it had always moved. The temple was dedicated to a goddess whose relationships with the king of the gods, with her own divine children, with the priestesses who served her and the mortals who fell under her long attention, were also in some sense never finished. The quarrel was not resolved in the tradition. It was not resolved in the Homeric poems, and not resolved in the tragedies, and not resolved in any sanctuary account that survives. What the tradition preserves is not the resolution, but the ongoing fact of the conflict itself, its scale, its duration, its remarkable variety of instruments, and the strange stability that two such powers apparently found in the very fact of their prolonged, elaborate, continuous disagreement. The marriage held because the conflict was contained within it, not despite the conflict but alongside it, and perhaps partly because of it. Two enormous independent powers who had existed before the marriage and would continue within it, and whose separate domains had never fully merged into a single shared one. Hera was girl and bride, and widow in the cult epithets. The tradition preserved its Stymphalus. Zeus was the hidden infant in the Cretan cave, and the young god who had overthrown his father and the king who administered the divine world from a summit in Thessaly. Between those two origins, between those two accumulated identities, the mythology placed a marriage that the Greeks understood as the central organizing fact of the divine arrangement, and then immediately, in the same texts, described it as a source of sustained conflict, from which the mortal world received most of the complications that mythological heroes were sent out to address. The 100 eyes of Argus are in the peacock's tail. The Kestos is back with Aphrodite, presumably, after the operations on Mount Ida were concluded. Eileithyia eventually left Olympus and arrived in time, or not in time, depending on which birth is in question. The Delos that once floated unmoored across the Aegean sits fixed to the seafloor now, its stone roots touching the bottom, the Aegean water moving above what has stopped moving. The golden apple tree is still standing at the western edge of the world, the serpent lading coiled at its base in the long unbroken circle, the Hesperides somewhere in the late afternoon light nearby. The cuckoo is still carved on the scepter. The stone that was wrapped in swaddling cloth and given to Cronus still exists somewhere in the tradition. The omphalos, the tradition says, the navel stone, the first thing Cronus disgorged when Zeus administered the emetic that freed his siblings, which some accounts place at Delphi as the center of the world. All of these things persist in the particular way that mythological images persist, not as objects that can be found and touched, but as images that the tradition carries forward without needing to be asked, that arrive unchanged in each new telling, because the tradition has decided they are essential to what it is trying to hold. The Quarrel is one of those images, not the particular episodes, not the rawhide thongs or the golden chains or the sleeping king on Ida or the throne. No one else could open, but the quarrel itself as a structural fact, the ongoing current of disagreement between two powers who between them administered everything the Greek tradition understood to be divinely ordered about the world. The long shadows of the Herion's columns move across the ground as the Aegean light shifts. The coastal air comes in off the water and crosses the unfinished colonnades, moving between the columns in the way air moves through large stone structures, channeled and directed and altered slightly by what it passes through. The river runs nearby toward the sea,